my channel Billionaire Disney Stories. Please like and subscribe and share my video. Thank you.
Future wife, wherever you are, I'm still waiting for your answer. He didn't say it like a joke, and he didn't say it out of desperation. He said it like a promise, like something already written in his destiny, long before the world even noticed his existence. Ion was not like everyone else. While people around him were busy chasing comfort, quick success, and validation from others, he was obsessed with something different, something bigger. He wanted to build a future that didn't just make him rich, but made him unforgettable. Nights were his reality. While the city slept, he stayed awake, sitting alone in front of a glowing laptop screen, typing, thinking, designing, failing, and trying again. The silence of his room wasn't empty. It was filled with ambition, pressure, and an unspoken hunger to become something extraordinary. But behind all that focus, behind all that discipline, there was a quiet space in his heart that no success had ever been able to fill. It was strange because he wasn't lonely in the usual sense. He didn't crave attention, he didn't need constant conversations, and he didn't chase people. Yet there was a feeling something incomplete, something waiting. And he knew exactly what it was. Not success, not money, not recognition. It was someone he had never met, never seen, but somehow believed existed. His future wife. It sounded crazy, even to himself sometimes, but he couldn't ignore it. Because in his mind, she wasn't just a person, she was a feeling, a connection waiting to happen, a presence that would understand him without explanations. Every night, right next to his screen, there was a small handwritten note stuck carefully where his eyes would always land when he paused. It didn't contain goals, strategies, or numbers. It simply said, don't just build a future, build a life worth sharing. That line kept him grounded. It reminded him that no matter how big his dreams were, no matter how far he went, success without someone to share it with would always feel incomplete. And that's why he kept thinking about her, not out of weakness, but out of clarity. He believed that somewhere out there was someone who wouldn't slow him down, but would stand beside him and push him further. Someone who wouldn't question his ambition, but would match it. Someone who would look at his chaos and see purpose. Sometimes in the middle of his work, he would stop, lean back in his chair, stare at the ceiling, and quietly whisper, I hope you're working hard too, because when we meet, I don't want to be average. That thought didn't distract him, it fueled him. It turned his waiting into discipline and his imagination into motivation. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Failures came one after another. His first project failed without anyone noticing. His second idea was rejected before it even got a chance. His third attempt was ignored completely. People around him started to doubt him. Some laughed quietly, others openly told him to be realistic. But Ion had already stopped listening because he understood something. Most people, Dante World only believes in you after you've already proven yourself. And until then, you walk alone. Maybe that's why the idea of her mattered so much to him. Because in his mind, she wouldn't doubt him. She wouldn't laugh. She wouldn't leave when things got hard. She would understand. And that belief, whether real or imagined, gave him strength on the days when nothing else did. One evening, after a long day filled with silent frustration and invisible effort, he closed his laptop and walked slowly toward the window. The city lights stretched endlessly in front of him, each one representing a different life, a different story, a different struggle. Somewhere in that endless sea of lights, he wondered if she existed in that very moment, maybe looking at the same sky, maybe chasing her own dreams, maybe feeling the same strange sense of waiting. He smiled slightly at the thought, shaking his head, knowing how unbelievable it sounded. Waiting for someone UV never met, believing in a connection that hasn't even started yet, it sounded unrealistic. But then again, every extraordinary idea sounds unrealistic in the beginning. He had always believed that the right person doesn't come into your life when you're searching for them, but when you're becoming the person they need. And that's exactly what he was doing. He was becoming stronger, sharper, more focused. He was building not just a career, but a version of himself that wouldn't settle for anything less than extraordinary. And that included love. He refused to settle, not because he thought he was better than others, but because he believed the right connection was worth waiting for. For him, love wasn't just about feelings. It was about alignment, growth, vision, and timing. It was about two people who didn't complete each other, but expanded each other. And until that happened, he was okay being alone, not forever, but for now. Because deep down, he knew this phase wasn't permanent, was preparation. Still, there were moments, Quaid, almost invisible moments when the waiting felt heavier than usual. Moments when he would stare at his phone for no reason, as if expecting something or someone. Moments when he would wonder if he was crazy for believing in something he couldn't prove. But even in those moments, he didn't give up, because belief doesn't need proof to exist. It just needs consistency. And Ion was consistent. Consistent in his work, consistent in his discipline, and strangely consistent in his faith that one day everything would make sense. That one day all the waiting, all the silence, all the effort would lead to a moment that would change everything. And then, one night, when the world was quiet and his room was filled with nothing but the soft glow of his screen, something small happened, something simple. A notification appeared, just one message from someone he didn't know. And in that exact moment, without him realizing it, the story he had been living alone was about to change. The waiting was finally about to mean something. The notification didn't look special. There was no dramatic sound, no flashing light, no sign that this moment was any different from the hundreds of other notifications he had ignored before. It was just a simple message request sitting quietly at the corner of his screen, almost easy to miss. But for some reason, something he couldn't explain, Ion paused. His fingers stopped moving across the keyboard, his focus shifted, and his eyes locked onto that one small notification as if it was calling him. It didn't make sense. He had trained himself to ignore distractions, to stay locked in, to never break momentum for something unimportant. Yet this felt different. Slowly, almost cautiously, he moved his cursor and clicked. The message opened, just a single line. "Hi, I think I know you." Ion frowned slightly, leaning closer to the screen. He didn't recognize the name. No mutual connections, no context, nothing. Just a sentence that somehow felt personal. He stared at it for a moment, debating whether to ignore it or respond. His logical mind told him this was random, meaningless, probably a mistake. But something deeper, something instinctively told him not to close it. So he replied, "How?" Simple, direct, no emotion, just curiosity. Seconds passed, then another message appeared. "Because you're the kind of person who doesn't stop." Ion's expression changed. That wasn't a normal reply. That wasn't guessing. That sounded like understanding. His mind immediately started questioning everything. Who was this? How could someone describe him like that without knowing him? Was it coincidence or something else? He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, trying to stay rational, but the feeling was growing stronger, the same strange feeling he had whenever he thought about her, his future wife. He shook his head lightly, almost dismissing the thought, but he couldn't ignore the connection. "You don't even know me," he typed. The reply came faster this time. "I don't need to. People like you are easy to recognize. You don't follow the crowd. You build your own path." Now he was silent, completely silent, because for the first time in a long time, someone had said something that felt real, not motivational, not generic, real. He had heard people talk about success before. He had read books, watched interviews, listened to advice. But this felt different. This felt like someone was speaking directly to him. Not to an audience, not to a version of him, but to who he actually was. "What's your name?" he finally asked. A short pause. Then the answer appeared. "Zara, just a name. Simple." But somehow it stayed. Ion repeated it in his mind without realizing it. Zara. There was no reason for it to matter, and yet it did. "How do you know all this?" he asked again, still trying to make sense of it. This time the reply took longer. When it finally came, it was different. "Because I think like you." That was it. No explanation, no proof, just a statement. But it was enough. Something shifted in that moment. Something subtle, almost invisible, but powerful. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't attraction. It was recognition. The kind that doesn't need time to grow. The kind that just exists. Their conversation didn't end there. It didn't fade like most random chats do. It continued. Slowly at first, then deeper, more intentional. They didn't talk about random things. They didn't waste time on meaningless topics. Every message felt like it had weight, purpose, meaning. "What are you building?" she asked at one point. Ion paused before answering, not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't used to people asking that question seriously. "Something that doesn't exist yet," he replied. "Good," she said. "Because if it already existed, it wouldn't be worth building." He smiled slightly. That was the first time. Not because it was funny, but because it felt right. The conversation kept flowing. Ideas, thoughts, perspective as things he had never shared openly before. And strangely, he didn't feel the need to hold back. It was effortless, natural, as if he had been waiting for this exact interaction without realizing it. Time passed quickly. Minutes turned into hours. The night grew deeper, but neither of them noticed. "Why do you work so much?" she asked. Ayan looked at the question for a moment. Most people ask that with judgment, with confusion, but this didn't feel like that. This felt like curiosity, real curiosity. "Because I don't want an average life," he answered. "And what does that look like?" she asked. He took a deep breath before typing. "It looks like building something meaningful and sharing it with someone who understands what it took." There was a pause after that, longer than before. For a second, he thought maybe he had said too much. Maybe the conversation would end there. But then her reply appeared. That's rare. Just 2 words, but they carried weight. "Most people want success," she continued, "but very few think about who they'll become in the process or who they'll share it with." Ayan stared at the screen, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time calm. Not the absence of stress, but the presence of understanding. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want?" Her reply came slowly, almost carefully. "I want a life that feels real, not perfect. I want to grow, not just exist. And I want someone who doesn't just love me, but pushes me to become better." Ayan didn't respond immediately, because for a moment, it felt like he was reading his own thoughts. Different words, same meaning. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else. Something he couldn't fully explain yet, but something he couldn't ignore either. From that night on, everything changed, but not in an obvious way. There were no dramatic confessions, no sudden emotional explosions, no unrealistic moments that felt forced or rushed. Instead, it was subtle, steady, and almost invisible to anyone outside of it. Ayan's routine didn't change. He still worked late nights, still pushed himself beyond limits, still chased his vision with the same intensity as before. But now, there was something different woven into his days. Something quiet yet powerful. Zara. She wasn't a distraction. She wasn't an escape. She became a part of his process, part of his thinking, part of the way he saw things. Their conversations didn't follow a pattern, yet they never felt random. One moment they were discussing ideas about the future, the next they were challenging each other's beliefs. And sometimes they would just sit in silence, no messages, no pressure, just the understanding that neither of them needed constant validation to stay connected. "You think too far ahead," she once told him. "And you don't think far enough," he replied. Instead of arguing, she asked, "Then show me what I am missing." And he did. He explained his vision, not in a way to impress her, but in a way to be understood. And she listened not to respond, but to actually understand. That was rare, extremely rare. Most people listen to reply. Very few listen to see you clearly. And Zara saw him clearly. Days passed, and slowly, without either of them saying it out loud, a connection formed, not rushed, not forced, built on something deeper than attraction, built on alignment. "Do you believe in timing?" she asked one night. "Yes," Ayan replied. "Then why do you act like everything depends on you?" He paused. That question stayed longer than the others, because it wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. "Because if I don't act," he said slowly, "nothing happens. And if you act too soon?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, because for the first time he didn't have a perfect response. And that's when he realized something. She wasn't there to agree with him. She wasn't there to admire him. She was there to challenge him, to sharpen him, to make him better. And strangely, he liked that a lot. Their conversations became a space where growth happened naturally. No ego, no competition, just honesty. Real, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. "You don't need to prove everything," she told him once. "And you don't need to question everything," he replied. She smiled and could almost feel it through the screen. That kind of connection doesn't need physical presence, doesn't need constant reassurance. It just exists, strong, steady, undeniable. But even then, something was missing. Not in a bad way, not as a problem, but as a question. Ayan had never seen her, never heard her voice, never experienced her beyond words on the screen, and yet she felt real, more real than most people in his life. That didn't make sense, and maybe that's why it mattered. One night, after hours of conversation, he finally asked the question that had been sitting quietly in his mind for days. "Why haven't we met?" The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then finally her message came. "Because you're not ready yet." Ayan's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in confusion. "Not ready for what?" he asked. This time her reply came instantly. not ready for me. Silence filled the space between them. Not uncomfortable silence, but heavy silence. The kind that makes you think. The kind that forces you to look at yourself honestly. For a moment, Ion wanted to argue, to prove her wrong, to explain why he was ready. But he didn't. Because deep down, part of him knew she might be right. And that realization didn't weaken him. It focused him. Then I will be, he finally replied. No drama, no overthinking, just a decision. And on the other side of the screen, Zara read that message and smiled, because she knew something he was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just a conversation. This wasn't just a connection. This was a test, a journey, a process that would either break him or transform him into someone who wouldn't just dream about the future, but become worthy of it. And from that moment on, everything they had wasn't about what they felt. It was about what they were becoming. Together, yet apart, connected, yet distant. And somehow that distance wasn't separating them. It was preparing them for something bigger, something real, something that, when the time finally came, wouldn't need explanations, because it would already make sense. The message stayed on his screen longer than anything else she had ever said. You're not ready for me. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't emotional, and it wasn't meant to hurt him. But somehow, it hit deeper than any rejection ever could, because it didn't come from doubt, it came from understanding, and that made it harder to ignore. Ion didn't reply immediately. For the first time since their conversations had begun, he felt something unfamiliar, hesitation, not because he didn't have something to say, but because whatever he said next mattered more than usual. His mind started racing, not with ideas or plans, but with questions. What did she mean by not ready? Was she talking about success, stability, growth, or was it something deeper, something he hadn't yet faced within himself? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle around him. The room felt different that night. He wasn't thinking about work or his next move or how to fix his current problems. He was thinking about himself. And that wasn't something he did often. Usually he stayed busy enough to avoid it. But now, there was no distraction strong enough to pull him away from that one thought maybe she was right. Have you ever been in a situation where someone sees something in you that you've been avoiding yourself? Not criticizing you, not judging you, just showing you a truth you weren't ready to accept yet. That's what this felt like. And instead of reacting, Ion chose to sit with it. Minutes passed, then an hour, still no reply from him. Not because he lost interest, but because he was thinking more deeply than ever before. Finally, he looked back at the screen, at her last message, and typed slowly, carefully, without trying to sound perfect or strong. Then, it'll become ready. He hit send and didn't add anything else. No explanation, no questions, just a decision. On the other side, Zara read the message almost instantly. There was no typing indicator after that. No long reply. Just one line. That's what I was waiting to hear. And just like that, the conversation ended for the night. But something had shifted. Something important. Something that neither of them needed to explain. The next few days felt different for Ion. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, powerful shift in his mindset. He wasn't just working anymore. He was evolving. Every task he took on, every challenge he faced, every failure he encountered at it, all started to feel like part of something bigger. Not just a journey toward success, but a journey toward becoming someone worthy of the life he imagined and the person he felt connected to. He became more focused, more intentional. Distractions that once tempted him now felt irrelevant. Conversations that once mattered now felt shallow. He wasn't isolating himself. He was refining himself. And in that process, he started to notice things he hadn't before. His weaknesses, his habits, his blind spots. The small ways in which he held himself back without even realizing it. And instead of ignoring them, he started facing them, one by one. Zara didn't message him much during those days. And strangely, that didn't bother him. There was no anxiety, no overthinking, no need for constant communication. Because what they had built wasn't dependent on daily messages, it was built on something deeper. Trust, understanding, alignment. And sometimes, distance strengthens that more than closeness ever could. But even in silence, her presence was there, in the way he thought, in the way he made decisions, in the way he pushed himself a little harder when things got difficult. She had become a part of his internal voice, not controlling him, but guiding him. One night, after days of intense focus and almost complete silence between them, Ion finally received another message. No greeting, no build-up, just a question. What did you change? He read it twice before replying, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to be honest, completely honest. The way I see myself, he wrote. There was a pause. Then she replied, explain. Ion leaned forward slightly, thinking, choosing his words carefully. I used to think success would make me ready. He typed. Now I think becoming better will. This time the reply came quickly. And what does better mean to you? He didn't rush this answer, because this wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was reflection, discipline without ego, confidence without arrogance, focus without losing myself, and the ability to understand someone else without needing to control them. He stopped typing, read it again, then sent it. A few seconds passed. Then her reply appeared. Now you're getting closer. That was it. No praise, no exaggeration, just acknowledgement. But it meant more than anything else. Days turned into weeks, and something incredible started to happen. Ion wasn't just improving, his work was improving himself. His thinking became sharper. His emotions became more stable. His reactions became more controlled. He stopped chasing quick wins and started building long-term value. And the more he grew, the more he understood why she had said what she said. He wasn't ready before, not because he lacked success, but because he lacked depth, and now he was building it. But growth comes with a price. There were nights when it felt heavy, nights when the silence between them felt longer than usual, nights when he wondered if all of this was real or just something he had created in his mind, nights when doubt tried to creep back in. And in those moments, he didn't run from it. He faced it, because now he understood doubt isn't the enemy. Avoiding it is. One night, unable to ignore the thought any longer, he sent her a message. What if I never become ready? The typing indicator appeared almost immediately. Then you will, she replied. Ion frowned slightly. That doesn't make sense, he typed back. Her answer came, calm and certain. It does. Because the version of you who asks that question is already growing. He stared at the screen, letting those words sink in. And for the first time in days, he smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because he finally understood something important. This wasn't about reaching a point where everything was complete. This was about becoming someone who never stops growing. And somewhere in that process, without even realizing it, Ion was no longer waiting in the same way he used to. Before, he was waiting for someone to enter his life. Now, he was becoming someone worth finding. And maybe, just maybe, that was the answer he had been searching for all along. Something changed inside Ion after that conversation. Not suddenly, not loudly, but in a way that quietly took control of everything he did. It wasn't just motivation anymore, and it wasn't just discipline either. It became something deeper, an obsession, but not the kind that destroys you. The kind that rebuilds you from the inside out. The kind that forces you to face truths you've been avoiding, to break habits you've been comfortable with, and to push beyond limits you once believed were permanent. Every morning, he woke up with a different kind of energy, not rushed, not chaotic, but focused and intentional. There was no more confusion about what he needed to do. There was no more hesitation. The goal was clear, no, not just success, not just recognition, but transformation. He didn't want to impress the world anymore. He wanted to become someone who didn't need validation from it. His routine became sharper, more structured, more intense. He started waking up earlier, not because someone told him to, but because he couldn't afford to waste time anymore. Time had started to feel different to him. Every hour mattered. Every decision mattered. Even the smallest actions carried weight because he knew they were shaping the version of him he was becoming. He cut off distractions without regret. Social media, meaningless conversations, unnecessary opinions, everything that didn't add value slowly disappeared from his life. Not out of anger or arrogance, but out of clarity. He finally understood something most people take years to realize, that you can't build an extraordinary life while living an ordinary routine. But this wasn't easy. It never is. There were moments when the pressure felt overwhelming, moments when exhaustion crept in, when his mind felt heavy, when his body wanted to slow down, moments when the old version of himself whispered, take a break, you've done enough. And maybe at some point he would have listened, but not anymore. Because now, there was something stronger than comfort driving him forward, a reason, a purpose, not just his dreams, but the idea of her, Zara. Not as a distraction, not as an escape, but as a symbol of what he was working toward. She wasn't someone he needed to impress. She was someone he needed to align with, and that required more than effort, it required growth. Have you ever pushed yourself so hard that you started discovering parts of yourself you didn't even know existed? strength you didn't realize you had, weaknesses you could no longer ignore. That's where Ion found himself, in a space where growth wasn't optional, it was necessary. His failures didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent. Bigger risks meant bigger setbacks. Projects didn't go as planned. Ideas didn't always work. There were days when nothing seemed to move forward, when everything felt stuck, when progress felt invisible. But the difference now was how he reacted. He didn't take failures personally anymore. He didn't let them define him. He studied them, learned from them, and moved forward with more awareness. Because he understood something important: failure isn't a sign that you're not good enough. It's proof that you're trying something difficult. Zara wasn't constantly present during this phase, but her impact was everywhere. Sometimes days would pass without a single message, and yet her influence remained in the way he thought, in the standards he held for himself, in the questions he asked before making decisions. It was as if she had become a part of his internal system, a quiet voice reminding him to stay aligned, to stay real, to keep growing. And when they did talk, the conversations were different now, deeper, more honest, less about ideas and more about reality. "Are you pushing too hard?" she asked one night. Ion read the message and paused, not because he didn't understand the question, but because he hadn't asked himself that. "Maybe," he replied honestly. "Then why don't you slow down?" she asked. He leaned back, thinking, then type, "Because I don't want to go back to who I was." There was a pause. Then her reply came. "Growth doesn't mean losing yourself." That line stayed with him, because she wasn't trying to stop him. She was trying to balance him, and that's what made her different. She didn't admire his obsession blindly. She understood it, but she also challenged it. Weeks passed, and slowly the results started showing. Not overnight success, not sudden breakthroughs, but progress. Real progress. The kind that builds quietly and becomes undeniable over time. His work started improving. His ideas became clearer. His execution became stronger. People began to notice, not because he was seeking attention, but because consistency eventually becomes visible. But even then, he didn't let it get to him, because now he knew external validation is temporary, but internal growth is permanent. One night, after a long day of work, he found himself sitting in silence again, just like before. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't filled with uncertainty. It was filled with clarity. He picked up his phone, opened their chat, and typed something he hadn't said before. "I think I understand now." The reply came after a few minutes. "Understand what?" He looked at the screen, then typed slowly. "Why you said I wasn't ready." "A pause." Then she replied, and he exhaled softly before answering. "Because I was trying to achieve things without becoming the person who could handle them." This time her response was immediate. Exactly. Just one word. But it confirmed everything. Ion looked out the window, the city lights glowing just like they did before, but his perspective had changed completely. He wasn't the same person who once stood there wondering if she existed. Now he knew she did. Not just as a person, but as a reality he was moving toward. And the most powerful part, he wasn't chasing her anymore. He was becoming the version of himself who would naturally meet her. And that realization shifted everything. Because now the journey wasn't about waiting. It was about becoming stronger, becoming wiser, becoming ready. And somewhere deep inside, without needing confirmation, he knew something was getting closer. Not just success, not just answers, but a moment, a real moment. The kind that changes everything without warning. The kind that makes all the effort, all the struggle, all the waiting make sense. And for the first time, he didn't wonder when it would happen. He just kept moving forward, because he knew when the time came, he wouldn't have to chase it. It would find him. By the time the message finally came, Ion wasn't the same person who had once stared at his screen, wondering if any of this was real. He had changed in ways that couldn't be measured by numbers, success, or recognition. His mindset was sharper, his emotions more controlled, his purpose clearer than ever before. He had stopped chasing outcomes and started trusting the process. And somewhere along that journey, the waiting had quietly transformed into readiness. So when his phone lit up that night, he didn't feel anxious. He didn't feel desperate, just felt calm. The message was simple, just like the first one had been. Are you ready now? He looked at the screen, reading it once, then again, not because he didn't understand, but because he wanted to feel the moment completely. There was no rush in his response. No need to prove anything. Just clarity. Yes, he typed. That was it. No long explanation, no emotional build-up, just a word that carried everything he had become. The reply came almost instantly. Then meet me. For a brief second, everything around him felt still. Not frozen, not dramatic, just quiet, as if the world itself had paused to let the moment settle. He didn't ask where. He didn't question how. Because deep down, he already knew These wasn't something uncertain anymore. This was the moment he had been moving toward all along. The location was simple. A small cafe, nothing luxurious, nothing overly designed to impress. Just a quiet place, almost ordinary. And maybe that's what made it perfect, because what was about to happen didn't need a grand setting. It just needed truth. Ion arrived early, not out of nervousness, but out of respect for the moment. He stepped inside, scanning the room slowly, not expecting anything dramatic, not expecting perfection, just reality. For a second, nothing stood out. Just people, conversations, the soft sound of cups and quiet music in the background. And then he saw her, sitting by the window, exactly where the light touched her just enough to make her presence feel calm, not overwhelming. She wasn't trying to stand out, yet she did. Not because of appearance, not because of anything obvious, but because of something deeper, something familiar. Ion stopped for a moment, just looking, not in disbelief, but in recognition. It wasn't shock. It wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. He walked toward her slowly, each step steady, grounded, real. No rush, no hesitation. When he finally stood in front of her, she looked up, and for a brief second, nothing was said. No awkward introductions, no forced smiles, no need to pretend. Just eye contact, real, clear, and filled with everything they hadn't said out loud before. Then she smiled, soft and natural. "You're late," she said, even though he wasn't. Ion let out a quiet breath, almost like a release of everything he had carried until that moment. "Worth the wait?" he replied. She held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded slightly. "Always." And just like that, the distance that once existed between them disappeared, not because they forced it, but because it was never truly there in the first place. They sat down, and what followed wasn't awkward, wasn't uncertain, wasn't filled with nervous energy, the way most first meetings are. It was calm, natural, as if they had already met 100 times before. The conversation didn't start with small talk. There was no, "So what do you do?" or "Tell me about yourself," because they already knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to skip the surface and go straight to what mattered. "You've changed," she said after a while, watching him closely. Ion didn't deny it. "So have you," he replied. She smiled slightly but didn't look away. "Not in the same way," she said. "Explain," he asked. She leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You became who you needed to be," she said. "I was already waiting to see if you would." That line didn't surprise him. It didn't confuse him. It made sense, because now everything made sense. Time moved differently in that moment. Minutes didn't feel like minutes. Conversations didn't feel like conversations. It felt like alignment, like two paths that had been moving separately had finally crossed at the exact point they were supposed to. There was no need to impress each other, no need to prove anything, just presence, real, grounded, and undeniable. At one point, Ion paused and looked at her, not as someone he had imagined, but as someone real, sitting right in front of him. "Why did you wait?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window for a moment, then back at him. "Because I wasn't looking for who you were," she said. "I was waiting for who you could become." Ion let that sink in, not as pressure, but as truth. "And if I didn't?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And then we wouldn't be here," she replied simply. There was no sadness in that answer, no regret, just honesty. And that's what made it powerful, because this wasn't a story built on chance. It was built on growth, on decisions, on becoming. As the conversation continued, everything felt lighter yet deeper at the same time. They talked about the journey, the silence, the doubts, the moments when things felt uncertain. And instead of those things creating distance, they created understanding, because both of them knew what it took to get here. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the result of everything they'd been through separately. At some point, without even realizing it, Ion smiled in a way he hadn't in a long time. Not because something was funny, not because something was said, but because everything felt right. And that feeling wasn't temporary. It wasn't based on the moment. It was based on alignment. And alignment doesn't disappear easily. As the evening slowly moved forward, neither of them felt the need to rush, to extend, or to control what was happening. Because for the first time, there was no uncertainty about what this was. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an answer. And as Ion sat there across from her in a place that looked ordinary but felt anything but, he realized something important. The waiting hadn't been about time. It had been about becoming. And now that both of them were there, the story wasn't starting, it was continuing. The night didn't end the way most stories do, because this was never about a perfect moment, and it was never about a fairy tale ending. It was about truth raw, earned, and undeniable. As the cafe slowly emptied and the outside world continued moving, without noticing what had just happened inside that quiet space, Ion and Zara remained exactly where they were, not because they had nowhere to go, but because neither of them felt the need to rush what they had found. There was a calmness between them now, something deeper than excitement, something stronger than attraction. It was certainty, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken out loud to be understood. Ion looked at her for a moment, not searching for answers anymore, not trying to figure anything out, but simply seeing her for who she was, not the idea he once held on to, not the imagined version that lived in his thoughts during lonely nights, but a real person who had walked her own path, faced her own struggles, and chosen to stand exactly where she was now. And in that realization, something inside him settled completely. "Can I ask you something?" Zara said softly, breaking the silence, though her voice carried no hesitation. Ion nodded, his expression calm. "When you used to say, 'Future wife, I'm waiting for your answer,' did you actually believe that?" For a brief second, Ion smiled, not out of amusement, but out of recognition of how far he had come from that version of himself. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly before answering. "At first, I didn't know if I believed it or not," he admitted. It felt like something between hope and madness. Zara watched him closely, her eyes searching for more than just words. "And now?" she asked. Ion met her gaze without hesitation this time. "Now I know I wasn't waiting for you," he said quietly. "I was becoming someone who could meet you." The words didn't sound dramatic, and they didn't need to, because they were real. And real things don't need exaggeration to be powerful. Zara didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, taking in not just what he said, but what it meant. Then, slowly, a small smile appeared on her face, not the kind meant to impress, but the kind that comes from understanding something deeply. "That's why I said you weren't ready," she replied. "Not because you weren't enough, but because you hadn't seen yourself clearly yet." Ion nodded slightly, not as agreement, but as acceptance, because he understood now. Everything silenced, the distance, the questions, the waiting, it all had a purpose. None of it was random. None of it was wasted. It was all part of something that couldn't have happened any other way. Outside, the night had grown quieter, the city lights softer, almost as if the world itself had slowed down. Inside, the space between them felt lighter, not because it had changed, but because it had become real. No more uncertainty. No more what if. Just presence. And in that presence, Ion realized something that went beyond this moment. The real love wasn't something you find when you're searching desperately. It's something that appears when you've built yourself enough to recognize it, to respect it, and to handle it without losing who you are. Zara leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table, her expression more serious now. "So tell me," she said, her voice calm but direct, "if I had said no, if I told you this wasn't what I wanted, what would you have done?" The question didn't surprise him. In fact, it felt like the final piece of something that had been building since the beginning. Ion didn't rush his answer. He looked at her, then down for a brief moment, as if choosing honesty over perfection. "I would have respected it," he said finally, "and I would have kept going." Zara's eyes didn't leave his. "Even after everything?" she asked. He nodded. "Because what I became wasn't just for you," he replied. "It was for me. You were the reason I started, but not the reason I would stop." There was no sadness in his voice, no fear, no attachment that felt desperate, just truth. And that truth changed everything. For a moment, Zara said nothing, and then, quietly, almost as if the words carried more weight than they seemed, she spoke. "Then you're ready." Ion didn't react immediately, but something in his eyes shifted, not excitement, not relief, but clarity. "Ready for what?" he asked, even though part of him already knew. Zara smiled slightly, her gaze steady, her voice soft but certain. "For your answer." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had built, everything they had understood, everything they had become. And then without hesitation, without overthinking, without fear, she said it. Yes, just one word, but it carried everything. No music, no dramatic pause, no perfect timing, just truth, spoken simply and clearly. And in that moment, nothing else was needed. Ion didn't react the way people expect in stories. He didn't stand up, didn't overexpress, didn't turn it into something bigger than it was. Instead, he smiled, A real smile. The kind that comes when something finally makes complete sense. Future wife. He said quietly, almost as if completing a sentence he had started a long time ago. I found you. Zara didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. Because some things don't require language. Some things are understood the moment they happen. And just like that, the waiting ended. But not the story. Because this was never about reaching an ending. It was about becoming someone who could begin something real. And now,